Hello again. When I broke through that Homeless Hands photography project, I was really able to get into it with people then. I befriended and dealt with loads of people living on the streets in Dublin, and through this, I heard their stories about how they became homeless and their stories of living on the streets and in the hostels and all of the shit that they have to deal with. Some of their stories were harrowing to say the least. One of the main findings was how there is a very real fragility of life in Ireland for a lot of people. It just takes one or two unfortunate life events or bad choices coupled with a lack of a social support network, and you can just become homeless very, very quickly. I really realised that it's the support network that is the biggest thing. With that in mind, I just want to tell you briefly some of the stories that came out of the interviews I was doing with people about how they ended up homeless. Alan, first of all, Alan was one of the first people I met, and I spent a lot of time hanging out with him, and we're still in touch, which is cool. He was 22 and he had a good job and was living with his girlfriend in a decent sized town outside Dublin. And then he lost his job very suddenly and without warning. And then, not long after that, his girlfriend broke up with him and he had to move out. And he couldn't go back to his family home because his stepfather was a violent abuser to both him and his mother. So he had nowhere to go and got a bus to Dublin with a backpack on with the plan of staying in a hostel for a little bit until he got a job and got himself sorted. And which is often the case, it just didn't work out that way. He's 25 now and still living between hostels and sleeping rough. He's a really good guy. And then Will was homeless and an addict 20 years ago, but he managed to get himself out of it and got clean and got a job and got a girlfriend and got a gaff. And he worked his way up in the job and started making decent money. And then one day he came home from work to find his best friend in bed with his girlfriend. Understandably, this led to a complete mental breakdown, which led to him losing his job. And his only support network were the two very people who had just completely destroyed him. So he ended up on the streets just like that. Fair play to him though, over the time that I was chatting with him, he managed to not slip back into addiction, which is pretty impressive. But after weeks of hanging out and chatting and filming and recording him, he completely disappeared one day, which was mad, and I had no idea what happened. But I really hope he got housed because he was saying that was something on the cards for him, and I guess I can understand why, if he got housed, he would just not answer the phone to me anymore. And then Dermot was a self-employed plasterer in Limerick, and he was doing really well with his business and building it up. And then very suddenly, his dad and his best friend, as he called him, died really suddenly. Dermot admittedly couldn't cope and started drinking, and then started drinking heavily, and then he became dependent, and he, needless to say, started losing work, and then he lost his business, and he had no one to go to. It was him and his dad, and that was kind of it. And he ended up in the streets and came to Dublin, and he again is just in and out of hostels and on the streets and caught in that trap. The last person I'll talk about is Linda, and I just want to tell her story because it's one that I heard so many times while talking to homeless women in Dublin. She was a victim of domestic abuse and didn't really have anywhere else to go, so she's on the streets, simple as that. And again, she's been bouncing between sleeping rough and hostels for nearly 7 years now, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it. So these are just a small sample of some of the stories I've heard, but as you can see, it can be so easy to happen. A couple of shitty things, or in some cases, maybe some bad choices, but we all make mistakes. That, along with a lack of a solid social support network of friends and families to fall back on, and that's it. You can be bollocks and on the street just like that. The majority of people in Ireland, myself included, up to learning what I learned in this project, are so privileged and don't really have a full understanding of just how fragile things can be. There is so much privilege in the safety net of family and friends to fall back on when you're stuck. Funnily enough, I was living in Switzerland for a lot of this project, which is a very privileged thing in many ways on many levels itself. But for my own personal reasons, I ended up having to move out of where I was living very last minute. And I was a student and pretty broke at the time and in a foreign country, obviously. And I just didn't have anyone to fall back on over there. I had no close friends, and so I had nowhere to go. But even though I was away from Ireland, I was still able to ring up my family for a lend of cash and some emotional, well, endless emotional support, which is a whole other side of privilege. But with that loan, I could afford to get my stuff into storage and could afford to stay in budget hostels and Airbnbs until I got myself sorted and could earn some cash to pay the money back. Like, what a fucking privilege that is. This was all completely coincidental that it happened while I was working on a project about homelessness, but it was kind of weirdly serendipitous because the experience really, really drove it home to me. I am an incredibly privileged person. Even when things are real hard for me, I am an incredibly privileged person. Most of us are incredibly privileged people. I'm repeating that word a lot, privilege. I think it'd be good for all of us to really try to realise this, just how privileged so many of us are. Think about how many times you've utilised that privilege. When you've turned to family or friends when you're stuck. And then think about those occasions and what might have happened if your support network wasn't there, if you didn't have that safety net. I think loads of us might have been on the streets many times over ourselves if we didn't have that privilege. And that's an unbelievably scary point of the crisis here in Ireland that isn't even discussed. You can't quantify people who are nearly homeless and don't even know it. Food for thought, I guess. A big learning curve for me anyway. We can do better. Cheers. More to come.